speaker.
Dr. Carsten Quell.
Dr. Carsten Quell is from Canada, and he is the Executive Director of the Centre of Excellence for Official Languages in Canada. Canada comes from a linguistic background, and he has worked in both public and private sectors. He has worked in various functions in policy and corporate policy during his career, as well as working for the Language Commissioner of Canada. And whilst working for the Commissioner for Official Languages in Canada, he came to know Colin. And he has worked very much with Colin since then, and they've become close friends. When we were discussing this conference with Carsten, the word number one fan came up in our conversation. Carsten, can I invite you to present
your talk this afternoon?
His presentation today will be about official languages in Canada. Please welcome Carsten Quell.
Pinanda, Carsten Quell, Adui, mijn vriend Dodama Gedafi.
Good afternoon, I'm Carsten Quell. It's an honor to be here with you.
Je me sens très privilégié de me retrouver parmi vous. C'est une journée spéciale pour nous tous, grâce à Colin. C'est grâce à lui que nous retrouvons ici aujourd'hui. Donc j'aimerais commencer mon petit discours avec un gros merci du fond du cœur à Colin, un cher ami à nous tous. Colin, without your erudition and persistence, language policy and language reality would certainly pour around the world today. I'm honored to be speaking to all of you here today. I also want to say diolch. I'm grateful to the Welsh Government for having brought me here all the way from Canada. The relationship between Colin and Canada is a long one, as you've been able to see from the beautiful slideshow. Those familiar with Colin's oeuvre know that Canadian language policy looms large in his work. What you may not know is that Colin has also left a lasting impression on Canadian language policy practitioners like myself. I consider myself fortunate to be one of those policy practitioners, and I'm here representing not just myself, but all of those Canadian colleagues and friends who've been influenced by Colin's work. Let me begin with a moment when I observed Colin in action. That was in 2015, when Colin was in Ottawa. Canada's Official Languages Commissioner Graham Fraser had organized a conference with language commissioners from around the world. Colin's role was that of rapporteur. After a long day of passionate debates and presentations that took us across diverse geographies and often slightly divergent perspectives, Colin was asked to put together the many strands. I remember sitting in the audience, wondering how he would accomplish what seemed to be a truly daunting task. From a corner in the room, he rose and delivered what can only be described as masterful. In his signature calm voice and modest demeanor, he pulled together the insights of many presentations, infused them with his own experience and wisdom, and delivered a conclusion and proposals for next steps that had everyone in the room nodding in somewhat surprised and amazed agreement. From the jumble of disparate insights, clarity and purpose emerged from Colin's remarks, and everyone rose in a kind of enlightened sense of wonder. I certainly did. Both Colin's laser-sharp analysis and his calm determination have had a lasting impact on me. And perhaps it also describes something that can be said of the policy context that I've been privileged to be working in for more than 20 years now, that of Canadian language policy. Analysis and determination. Over the next little while, I hope to take you into that context of Canadian language policy. So, What is Canada in linguistic terms? Let's start with some very basic facts. Out of close to 40 million Canadians now, 37 million at the last census 3 years ago, about 21% have French as their first official language. Most of those are concentrated in the province of Quebec, but there are French-speaking minority communities across the country, as there is an English-speaking minority community in Quebec. A key element in Canada's approach to language is what I would call ambitious pragmatism. Let's consider the ambition part first. English and French, under Canada's Official Languages Act, enjoy equality of use and status in Parliament and in the Government of Canada. Significant investment is made to support French and English-speaking minority communities across the country. For example, the total Government of Canada investment in official languages per year currently stands at 820 million Canadian dollars. That's 480 million pounds or 560 million euros. This money supports education in French outside Quebec and in English in Quebec. It supports linguistic minority health services. It seeks to bring in more French-speaking immigrants, and I'll be talking about that a bit more in a little while. And it supports language causes before the courts, because sometimes you have to go to court to get your rights exercised. It also provides funding for nearly 500,000 English-speaking children, youth, that are studying not just French as a second language, but studying in French immersion programs. And it makes sure that the government's services are delivered in English and French in every single province and territory. That last point is a curious one. Let's consider it again. Federal services in Canada are available in English and French in every single province and territory. That statement is true, but it's also true that not every single point of service is bilingual, and there are more than 10,000 of them. Not every post office is bilingual or every federal center for employment services. In fact, only 1/3 of those points of service is. You might find that surprising, especially in light of the significant investment that I've just mentioned. Well, it's something that speaks to the pragmatism in Canadian language policy. Canada tries to strike a balance. As I've said, there are many places outside Quebec where French is spoken, and within Quebec, English is spoken. But the government decided that services are provided only when the minority community exceeds 5% of the local population of the area served by an office. Otherwise, services are only offered either in English or in French. I will get back to this example in a little while. Canada is at a turning point in the evolution of its language policy. That is because last year marked only the second time that its official languages legislation was reformed. The first time was in 1969 and then again in 1988. So it's taken 35 years to update the Official Languages Act. As the new legislation was deliberated in the House of Commons and Canada's upper chamber, the Senate, I had the privilege of witnessing firsthand before parliamentary committees the debates, and I was called upon to be a technical expert at the committees. It was a front row seat, allowing me to experience both intellectually and viscerally the passion but also the careful consideration with which language policy is treated in Canada. So about a year ago, I was in front of one of those committees, and one of the proposals being considered was to make all points of service of the government bilingual across the country. It seemed like a good idea. As an expert witness, I was asked what the impact would be. I answered that it would have the impact, for example, of making every post office guarantee services in both languages at any given time, which would mean that bilingual employees would have to be recruited or current employees undergo language training. Remember that this would only apply to situations where the minority community is below the 5% threshold. So I said, for example, it would mean that the post office employee in a small village in Quebec, where most people use French, hardly anyone speaks English, the post office employees would have to be able to offer service in English and French. Parliamentarians quickly realized that this was not in line with what they had in mind for the overall legislation, and particularly not with the new emphasis on protecting and promoting French. So the ambition of making every point of service bilingual was tempered with the pragmatism and practicality of what this would actually entail. Public services is one and important, but not everything about language policy. Before I give you more of a taste of what animates language policy in present-day Canada, I want to take you back into history, 60 years ago to be exact. At the time, Canada was at a crisis point. In response to rising nationalism in Quebec, Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson struck what was called the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism. 10 commissioners traveled the country to hear what Canadians thought about three main lines of inquiry: bilingualism in the federal government, how to promote better relations between English and French, and what opportunities existed for Canadians to become bilingual. I hope this will work. I would like to now show you a short excerpt from a newscast at the time. So this was the 6th of May, 1964.
Canada is not a bilingual country. We have been led to believe that it is. It has been taught in our schools, but it is not a bilingual country. Therefore, I do not believe that French should be taught in our public schools, in the junior grades.
We can't just pretend that French aren't here. We gotta mix with them. We can, if we, like, we're learning French, and if we can learn our French good enough, I could even go up to Quebec and speak to the people. But if I didn't have French, I could go over there and I wouldn't know anything they were saying. Well, why shouldn't we learn both cultures? We're Canada. We're Canadians. Why can't we learn what other people think? Some people think that bilingualism is good for nothing. Well, why shouldn't we learn all the languages we can? It just makes us smarter.
The Great Debate, Le Grand Débat. A CBC News special report.
Good evening, I'm Ken Mason. Today, from St. John's to Victoria, Canadians are agonizing in public over their identity. They're asking themselves some pretty frank questions about what they think of each other and getting equally frank answers back. Opinions run to extremes as far apart as the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and in between those extremes, 1,001 variations. The greatest public debate in the country's history is swirling around the Federal Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism, a commission which is studying a different type of problem and approaching it in a revolutionary way. The 9 men and 1 woman on the commission have been asked to inquire into the state of B&B in Canada and to recommend ways of building a stronger confederation based on an equal partnership between the 2 founding races, but at the same time not forgetting the contributions made by other nationalities. Instead of waiting for organizations to come forward with briefs, the commission has been going to the people and, with some degree of success, asking for spontaneous views on the problems that tend to divide French and English Canada.
And I don't see why there is such a terrible emphasis put on French. I can't see what good it is to us. I think this whole thing could be settled so easily if they would teach their children English in school in Quebec. We wouldn't need the French language here.
Every time I see this video, I'm moved. It encapsulates for me the changes that have occurred in Canada over the past half century, but also the value of enduring public debate. There is no end state to language policy, only moments in time. But looking back, we can see the road traveled and derive confidence from the capacity for change. And you will have heard mentioning 9 men, 1 woman, the 2 founding races. Those are all things that certainly would not happen today. The newscaster mentioned that the views of many nationalities were considered. Well, one view that was entirely absent during the deliberations was an Indigenous perspective. Indigenous people were not consulted. But what you just saw also gives hope. The young woman who said that she can learn French and then, it enables a conversation with Quebec. I think that was a hopeful voice at the time and a growing voice. Of course, the last person that you saw suggesting that Francophones simply abandon their language and speak English, today that's an almost unthinkable proposition for anyone to make. So, has history validated the young woman's optimism? In many ways it has. I mentioned that today, with the support of the federal government, there are 500,000 young English-speaking Canadians learning French in immersion schools. At the same time, though, the rate of bilingualism outside of Quebec has stagnated at 10% for many years. The optimists 60 years ago certainly would have hoped and expected more. The pessimists, on the other hand, may not have expected the overall political climate to be as positive and as embracing of bilingualism as it is today. So I want to describe a little bit more to you Canada's linguistic context today. To properly understand it, I hope you'll indulge me in another video. Here, I'll stop it sort of halfway through. It gives you a good idea of what issues Canada is grappling with today.
It's one of the first things visitors to Canada notice about our country. We use both English and French. But are most Canadians actually bilingual? Well, whether we eat cornflakes or flocons de maïs for breakfast, most of us understand at least a little of the other language. But why does Canada have 2 official languages? When the British defeated the French in the 1760s, English became the dominant language in the land we now call Canada. Lots of people still spoke French, of course, especially in Quebec. But the language of power, the language of business, English. If Francophones, French-speaking people that is, wanted to get ahead, they pretty much had to learn English. By the 1960s, Francophones in Quebec were fed up. Some even demanded the province separate from Canada and create a new French-speaking country. In 1969, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau's Liberal government passed the Official Languages Act. Its goal? Ensuring that English-speaking and French-speaking Canadians got equal service from the federal government. Official bilingualism meant all kinds of things had to be printed in both languages, but not everything. If it was a local or provincial responsibility, it could be in one language. Out of all the provinces, only New Brunswick has declared itself officially bilingual. Many Quebec Francophones worried that bilingualism meant English would squeeze their language out. So in 1977, Quebec passed Bill 101, La Charte de la langue française, which protected French as the main language there. Of course, there are hundreds of thousands of French-speaking Canadians who live outside Quebec. Most Canadians speak English or French. Hundreds of thousands also speak an Indigenous language. Some Canadians, well, they kind of speak both French and English at the same time. In parts of New Brunswick, they've been combining Acadian French with a bit of English for more than 300 years. It's called Chiac. But before the English, before the French, even before the Vikings, for thousands of years before Europeans arrived, the first peoples of this territory spoke all kinds of languages. These were spoken, not written, although many also had sign languages. In some areas, European missionaries or teachers created symbols known as syllabics to write down words from Indigenous languages. For 150 years, the federal government forced Indigenous children into residential schools, where they were often punished for speaking their own languages. When they returned home, many couldn't understand their grandparents' stories, or even talk to their parents. But many Indigenous languages have survived, and more Indigenous people are learning them. The Métis Nation has its...
I'll stop it here. I'll get back to the issue of Indigenous languages in a moment, but before we do, I want to address 5 questions around that animate the language policy context in Canada today. First, what are the demographic challenges for French speakers in Canada? Second, what is the level of French-English bilingualism among Canadians? How is immigration affecting Canada's linguistic landscape? What is the state of Indigenous languages? And what does all of this mean for Canada going forward? Are there any good practices that can be adopted, should be adopted in Canada or beyond? So let's talk about the demographic challenges for French speakers in Canada today. I mentioned earlier that there are French speakers outside of Quebec and English speakers in Quebec. So if you look up here, I don't know, I hope you can see it. It's a bit of... within Quebec, 82% of the population is French speaking, but outside that province, New Brunswick, 34%. In any other province or territory, French is spoken by 5% or fewer of the population. Now, the current demographic challenge, and I think this resonates a little bit with what I heard today about the Welsh language, and some of the context in Catalonia, I think that challenge is well illustrated here. The bars represent the total number of speakers. There's consistency across time at about 1 million French speakers outside Quebec, but you can see that the proportion of French speakers compared to the general population is declining. Why is that the case? It's because of immigration. Immigration is the biggest driver of population growth in Canada. We heard about Catalonia. Also, Canada has fairly low birth rates. And so immigration is looked upon, obviously, for the future of the country. But with the arrival of more immigrants, the only way for the French-speaking minority to stay demographically competitive is to attract immigrants into their ranks. They've been working hard at this, and now the Government of Canada, in September of last year, created the first official policy on Francophone immigration outside Quebec. Quebec has had an immigration policy for decades, but this is a new commitment on the part of the federal government. And the commitment is quite specific. It is to reestablish the demographic weight of French speakers outside Quebec to 6.1%, which is the percentage that they had in 1971. I think that is ambitious, and it's a tall order, especially as Quebec is also trying to attract Francophone immigrants. But the change is already underway. Over the last 3 decades, we've seen a transformation of the French-speaking communities from ones that were traditionally Catholic, French-Canadian, to communities of French speakers who have attracted immigrants from Europe, but especially from Africa. Next, let's look at bilingualism in Canada. The big number in the top right looks quite impressive, 18%. So nearly 1 in 5 Canadians is bilingual. But if you look at the breakdown across the country, you realize that the highest level of bilingualism is in Quebec, with nearly half the population saying that they can conduct a conversation in both official languages. New Brunswick is next with 34%, but in other provinces and territories, the percentage is 10%. looking at this graph gives you a bit of sobering second thought on the good news around bilingualism, because the growth of bilingualism in Canada derives mostly from Quebec. Proficiency in English there has increased from 25% in 1951 to nearly 50% today. But in the rest of Canada, so that's the top line, in the rest of the country, the bottom line, the rate of bilingualism increased from 7% in 1951 to 10% today, but it's basically a flat line over the last 3 decades. Now, how is immigration affecting Canada's linguistic landscape? You've got the major immigrant groups and their languages represented here. So what we see is that more than 500,000 people speak predominantly Mandarin or Punjabi at home in Canada. And when we look at more closely at the demographic context in Canada, we see the following. So I already mentioned 37 million people at the last census. 23% of Canadians are foreign-born. That is the highest proportion since Confederation in 1867. The previous record was 22% in 1921. And it's also the largest proportion of foreign-born among G7 countries. 25% of Canadians report at least one mother tongue other than English or French. But now look at the next bullet. 189,000 people, that is 0.5% of the population, report having at least one Indigenous language as their mother tongue. And then finally, 4.6 million Canadians speak predominantly a language other than English or French at home. That is 12% of the population. So let's consider this for a minute. What are we looking at in terms of the big 3 dynamics? The need to protect and promote the French language, both in Quebec and beyond, a high degree of immigrant languages, and thirdly, the precarious state of many Indigenous languages. Let's look at that last point. What is the state of Indigenous languages? I mentioned 189,000. Those are people who have an Indigenous language. They report in Indigenous languages as at least one of their mother tongues. So Statistics Canada allows you to report more than one mother tongue or first official language or first language spoken, if that's the case. 237,000 people report being able to speak an Indigenous language, but even at that measure, the percentage is declining, 4.3% since the previous census. We have to remember, these are Canada's first languages. They were spoken in Canada for thousands of years before the arrival of European settlers. And we have to accept, as much as we defend French and English in Canada, that these are official languages that are languages of colonization. When we look at this next graph, we see that that Indigenous languages are in use. So particularly 2 languages are doing fairly well. One is Inuktitut. That's the language that's spoken in Canada's Northern Territory of Nunavut, where it is spoken predominantly in the home. So 65% of the population of that territory speaks Inuktitut. The next language is Cree, which is concentrated in the prairie provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. So, what does it mean for language policy in Canada? It brings us back to the Official Languages Act, which was adopted last June with near unanimous consent in Parliament. The new legislation recognizes the trends that I've just described, and I hope you'll indulge me if I read from the legislation because it is quite telling. So, on immigration, the new act says, the Government of Canada recognizes the importance of Francophone immigration and it recognizes the importance of remedying the decline in the demographic weight of French linguistic minority communities, including by restoring and increasing their demographic weight. On the protection and promotion of French, it says, the Government of Canada recognizes that Quebec's Charter of the French language provides that French is the official language of Quebec, and that the French language requires specific measures in Quebec and outside to ensure that it will continue to thrive in a North American context that is very much dominated by English. And on other languages, the legislation states, the Government of Canada recognizes the importance of maintaining and enhancing the use of languages other than English and French, and reclaiming, revitalizing, and strengthening Indigenous languages while strengthening the status and use of the official languages. Obviously, the legislation, this is the preamble, the legislation contains more specifics regarding how to implement these objectives. So I think this legislation is ambitious and pragmatic, and it seeks to strike a balance between the various dynamics that Canada is grappling with linguistically. I have one last slide. The numbers here will be difficult to see, but it's a map of those around about 10,000 offices. If you look at Ontario and Quebec, the two biggest provinces, they're almost mirror images. So in Ontario, you have 70% of federal offices being unilingual, 30% bilingual. In Quebec, 30% are bilingual, the rest, 70%, is French only. What is happening is we are carefully moving up from currently 30% bilingual offices to 40%. But that gradual increases, as I mentioned at the beginning, due to making sure that we balance the rights of minority communities, targeting the services where the demand actually exists, with the need to ensure that we do not unduly cut out Canadians from employment opportunities with their government. One thing I would like to mention is that there are places across Canada where bilingual services are offered automatically. And one good example is national parks. So if you come to a national park in Canada, you will always be guaranteed service in English and French. That is important both symbolically and practically. So, for example, if you imagine you're driving from Quebec across the country to see the Canadian Rockies, you enter a national park in Banff, for example, you will be greeted and you receive services in French. And I've done that, and it works really well. And there's a lot of temporary employment, a lot of students that are hired, for example, but because of the fairly large pool of bilingual students that have been created, staffing those positions is not too difficult. So I hope to have given you in the last few minutes an idea, a taste for the rich and sometimes contentious tapestry of languages in Canada. I could go on for longer, but I'll stop and just maybe use an expression that we hear often in Quebec. It's quand je me regarde, je me désole, quand je me compare, je me console. It loosely translates as, when I look at myself, I lose heart, but when I compare myself, I take heart. When we look at the challenges today, it's easy to feel that the mountain is too hard to climb. But when we look back, down the valley, over time, we see what we have accomplished, and that should give us hope. Canada 60 years ago was in a very different place. The challenges today are real, but the attention that language issues attract are also very real. The support generally for both official languages is quite substantive. Before I conclude, I would like to quote Colin. He wrote, Perfidious hope may yet give way to public gain in matters of language legislation, but only if the respective minority language is treated as a public good and not seen as an outmoded expression of historical special pleading. This quote, and we've heard many instances where we've talked about the public good today, really resonates with me. Language is a public good. The Welsh language is a public good. The French language in Canada is a public good, and so are Indigenous languages. A minority language needs a context where the linguistic majority embraces it as a public good, whether they speak it or not. Achieving the right balance is hard and requires honest and respectful debate. One person's ambition may appear overzealous to another, and someone's realism may be viewed as indolence by someone else. As a civil servant, I try to practice the art of compromise every day, but I also need guidance. And here is where I want to end with an expression of immense gratitude to Colin. Diolch, Colin, merci. Your wisdom and intellect and your calm determination are an inspiration to us all.